The mop bucket wheels squeaked against the polished concrete floor of Naval Special Warfare Command, a sound that had become as familiar as breathing to the figure pushing it. Dawn crept through the high windows of Building 618, casting long shadows across the corridors where America's most elite warriors prepared for operations that would never make the evening news. But this morning, something was different. The usual morning briefings had been canceled. Hushed conversations died abruptly when the janitor appeared, and eyes followed movements that had been ignored for 18 months. Major General Patricia Storm Blackwood adjusted the faded maintenance coveralls one final time, her calloused hands steady despite the weight of what was about to unfold. The nameplate on her chest read simply, P. Martinez, a carefully constructed identity that had allowed her to move undetected through the most secure military installation on the West Coast. For over a year, she had emptied trash cans filled with classified fragments, mopped floors where billion-dollar operations were planned, and listened to conversations that revealed the true pulse of American special operations. The SEALs called her Ghost behind her back, not knowing how accurate that nickname was. She had earned her real call sign, Storm, 12 years ago in the skis over Afghanistan, where her FA-18 Super Hornet had turned the tide of a battle that saved an entire Marine battalion. But that was before the incident, before the court-martial that wasn't quite a court-martial, before a career built on precision and honor had been systematically dismantled by men who couldn't stomach the idea of a woman outflying them in combat. The maintenance closet she now called her base of operations was a far cry from the flight deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, but it had served its purpose. Every piece of intelligence she had gathered, every conversation overheard, every security vulnerability observed had been meticulously documented and transmitted through encrypted channels to a select group of Pentagon officials who still believed in justice over politics. Today, that careful surveillance would end. The cleaning supplies would be abandoned, the coveralls discarded, and 18 months of calculated invisibility would give way to a revelation that would shake Naval Special Warfare Command to its foundation. The general was coming, and with him, answers that had been 18 months in the making. The morning sun climbed higher, its light now streaming directly through the windows and illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny messengers of change. Storm pushed the mop bucket one final time down the familiar corridor, each squeak of the wheels counting down the seconds until everything would change. The SEALs who had dismissed her, ignored her, treated her as furniture, were about to learn that the most dangerous enemy is often the one hiding in plain sight. Commander Jake "Razor" Morrison stepped out of the briefing room, his weathered face wearing the expression of a man who had seen too much combat to be surprised by anything. At 38, he was one of the youngest team commanders in SEAL history, his reputation built on successful operations across 4 different theaters of war. His team respected him not just for his tactical brilliance, but for his ability to see potential where others saw only problems. This morning, however, something was troubling him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The intelligence briefing had been deliberately vague, filled with the kind of bureaucratic language that usually preceded either a career-ending assignment or something so classified that even SEALs weren't cleared to know the full scope. All he knew was that a special inspection was scheduled, conducted by someone with enough stars on their collar to make admirals nervous. The timing felt wrong, coming just weeks before his team was scheduled to deploy on a mission that had been 16 months in the planning. "Ghost's been acting weird lately," commented Petty Officer First Class Miguel Tank Rodriguez, nodding toward the janitor who was methodically working her way down the hallway. Tank was built like his nickname suggested, 5 feet 10 inches of pure muscle compressed into a frame that could carry twice his body weight in gear and still move like a shadow. Usually she just does her thing and disappears. Past few days she's been, I don't know, different. Morrison followed Tank's gaze to the slight figure in maintenance coveralls. He had to admit there was something different about the way she moved today. Where before there had been the resigned shuffle of someone invisible, today there was purpose, almost military bearing. The observation tickled something in the back of his mind, a recognition that refused to surface. Different how? Morrison asked, his team leader instincts automatically cataloging potential threats and anomalies. Hard to explain, sir, just sharper, like she's paying attention to everything instead of nothing. Tank paused, considering his words carefully. My grandmother always said the best way to learn about people is to watch them when they don't think anyone's watching. Ghost there, she's been watching us for months, but now it feels like she's getting ready for something. The observation hung in the air between them as Storm continued her methodical progress down the corridor. Neither SEAL could have known that every step was calculated, every movement part of a final reconnaissance before the most important mission of her career. The woman they knew as Ghost was indeed getting ready for something. She was preparing to reclaim an identity that had been stripped away by cowardice and corruption. The intercom crackled to life, interrupting Morrison's thoughts. All personnel report to the main briefing room at 800 hours. Full dress uniforms required. This is not a drill. The corridor erupted into controlled chaos as elite warriors scrambled to meet an unexpected requirement. Storm watched it all unfold, her expression never changing, but her hands gripping the mop handle with the same intensity she had once used on a fighter jet's control stick. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Chen emerged from the communications center with the kind of urgency that made seasoned operators reach instinctively for their weapons. As the senior intelligence officer for Naval Special Warfare Group 1, she was accustomed to crisis management, but the message she had just received from Pentagon brass was unlike anything in her 12-year career. The classification level alone required her to brief the commanding officer personally, and the time sensitivity meant that protocol would have to bend to accommodate reality. Phoenix moved through the corridors with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to navigate male-dominated spaces, being twice as competent and half as visible as her counterparts. Her slight frame and unassuming demeanor masked a mind that could process complex battlefield intelligence faster than most computer systems, and her ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos had saved countless lives in operations spanning 3 continents. The maintenance worker cleaning nearby looked up as Phoenix passed, and for just a moment their eyes met. There was something in that gaze that made Phoenix pause, a depth of understanding that seemed entirely at odds with someone whose job involved emptying wastebaskets and mopping floors. The moment passed quickly, but the impression lingered as Phoenix continued toward the commanding officer's quarters. Captain William Hammer Jackson was already reaching for his phone when Phoenix knocked on his door. At 52, Jackson had commanded Naval Special Warfare Group 1 for 3 years, his leadership style built on the principle that elite units required elite leadership to function effectively. His office walls displayed commendations from operations that officially never happened, and his desk held photos of men who had paid the ultimate price for freedom in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. "Sir, we have a situation," Phoenix began, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone delivering news that would change everything. "I just received a priority alpha communication from the Joint Chiefs. Major General Patricia Blackwood is inbound for immediate inspection and assessment. ETA 15 minutes. Jackson's hand froze halfway to the phone. The name Patricia Blackwood was known throughout the special operations community, though few knew the full story of her rise and fall. What most knew was that she had been one of the most decorated female combat pilots in Navy history, before disappearing into the bureaucratic machinery of the Pentagon, following what official records described as administrative reassignment. "Blackwood," Jackson repeated, his mind racing through the implications. "What's her interest in our operations?" "That's where it gets interesting, sir," Phoenix continued, consulting her encrypted tablet. The communication referenced Operation Ghost Protocol and included authorization codes that I've never seen before. Whatever this is about, it has the attention of people with enough clearance to make us all disappear if necessary. Through his office window, Jackson could see the maintenance worker continuing her methodical cleaning routine, seemingly oblivious to the controlled chaos erupting around her. Something about the timing felt too convenient, too perfectly orchestrated to be coincidence. In his experience, when elite units faced unexpected inspections by legendary officers, someone usually knew more than they were letting on. The sound of rotors began echoing across the compound, growing stronger with each passing second. The U-60 Black Hawk settled onto the landing pad with the precision of a surgical instrument, its rotors creating a dust storm that sent loose papers swirling across the tarmac. Through the helicopter's windows, the assembled naval special warfare personnel could make out three figures in dress uniforms, their ranks and decorations catching the morning sunlight like distant stars. But it was the fourth figure that commanded attention, a woman in army dress blues whose presence seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the compound. Major General Patricia Storm Blackwood stepped from the aircraft with the fluid movements of someone who had commanded respect on battlefields across 3 continents. Her uniform was immaculate, each ribbon and decoration telling a story of courage under fire, leadership in impossible circumstances, and sacrifices that extended far beyond the call of duty. The silver star caught the light as she moved, a reminder of a day in Afghanistan when her actions had saved the lives of an entire Marine battalion. But it was her eyes that truly commanded attention, steel gray, sharp with intelligence, and carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much and learned even more. As she approached the formation of SEALs standing at attention, her gaze swept across faces that ranged from curious to concerned to completely bewildered. These were America's most elite warriors, men who feared nothing and no one, yet something in General Blackwood's presence made them unconsciously straighten their already perfect posture. The maintenance worker had stopped cleaning and moved to the edge of the formation, still clutching her mop, but now standing with a bearing that seemed entirely at odds with her humble position. Phoenix noticed this transformation first, her intelligence training automatically cataloging the change in body language, the shift from invisible service worker to something that looked suspiciously like military attention. General Blackwood's eyes found the maintenance worker immediately, as if guided by some invisible radar. The two women locked gazes across 30 yards of sun-bleached concrete, and in that moment, everyone present felt the electrical charge of recognition passing between them. The general's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, not warmth, exactly, but acknowledgement of a game well played and a mission successfully completed. Officers and enlisted personnel of Naval Special Warfare Group 1. General Blackwood's voice carried across the formation with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. You have been assembled this morning to witness the conclusion of an 18-month investigation into security protocols, operational integrity, and personnel management within your command structure. The words hit the formation like a physical blow. 18 months, the exact amount of time that the maintenance worker known as Ghost had been invisibly moving through their most secure areas, listening to their conversations, observing their procedures, and apparently reporting everything to levels of command that existed far above their normal chain of authority. Commander Morrison felt his world tilting slightly off its axis as understanding began to dawn. Tank's observation about Ghost acting differently suddenly took on new significance, and the seemingly random presence of a maintenance worker at the edge of their formation began to make terrible sense. General Blackwood began walking toward the maintenance worker with measured steps. The distance between General Blackwood and the maintenance worker seemed to stretch like elastic, each step creating a tension that was almost visible in the desert air. The assembled SEALs watched in stunned silence as their understanding of reality shifted beneath their feet like quicksand. The woman they had dismissed as furniture, whose presence had become as unremarkable as the concrete walls around them, was somehow connected to this legendary general in ways that defied every assumption they had made. Storm, though she was still wearing the nameplate that read P. Martinez, felt the weight of 18 months of careful deception lifting from her shoulders with each step the general took. The coveralls that had been her disguise now felt like a costume that no longer served its purpose. Her hands, which had gripped mops and pushed cleaning carts, remembered the feel of a fighter jet's control stick and the precise movements required to deliver ordnance with surgical accuracy. "Major General Blackwood," Storm said, her voice carrying across the formation with crystal clarity. The maintenance worker's shuffle was gone, replaced by the bearing of an officer who had commanded respect in the most dangerous skis on Earth. "Operation Ghost Protocol is complete. Full intelligence package ready for transfer." The transformation was instantaneous and complete. Where moments before had stood an invisible service worker, now stood a military officer whose posture, voice, and presence commanded immediate attention. The coveralls couldn't disguise the sharp intelligence in her eyes or the way she held herself with the confidence of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious. General Blackwood stopped directly in front of Storm, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that the assembled SEALs were only beginning to understand. Finally, the general raised her right hand in a crisp salute that acknowledged not just rank, but respect earned through extraordinary service under impossible circumstances. "Colonel Esperanza Storm Vasquez," General Blackwood said, her voice carrying clearly across the formation. "Your country owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." The name hit the assembly like a thunderclap. Colonel Esperanza Vasquez, Storm, was a legend in naval aviation circles, a pilot whose combat record included successful missions that had been deemed impossible by conventional wisdom. Her disappearance from active duty had been the subject of speculation throughout the special operations community, with most assuming she had been killed in a classified operation or had suffered some career-ending injury. Commander Morrison felt his legs nearly buckle as understanding crashed over him. The maintenance worker who had emptied his trash, cleaned his office, and moved through their secure areas like a ghost was one of the most decorated combat pilots in modern military history. Every casual dismissal, every moment of treating her as invisible, every assumption about her capabilities replayed in his mind with excruciating clarity. Tank's face had gone completely pale, his usual confidence replaced by the realization that he had been unknowingly observed by someone whose tactical awareness exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. The general's salute held steady, waiting for a response that would officially end 18 months of the most successful deep-cover operation in naval special warfare history. Colonel Vasquez returned the salute with military precision, her movements sharp and confident after months of deliberate invisibility. The simple gesture seemed to transform not just her appearance, but the entire atmosphere of the compound. Where moments before there had been confusion and uncertainty, now there was the electric tension of truth finally being revealed. "General," Storm said, her voice now carrying the authority of her rank and experience. "Security assessment complete. Vulnerabilities documented. Personnel evaluations concluded." She paused, her steel-gray eyes sweeping across the formation of SEALs who had unwittingly been under surveillance for 18 months. "Recommendations ready for implementation." General Blackwood lowered her salute and stepped closer, her voice dropping to a level that still carried clearly across the silent formation. "Colonel, your service record speaks for itself. 47 combat missions, 3 distinguished flying crosses, a silver star for actions that saved the lives of 83 Marines under fire, and now 18 months of flawless deep-cover intelligence gathering in one of our most secure facilities." Each commendation struck the assembled SEALs like a physical blow. The woman they had called Ghost, whose presence they had barely acknowledged, whose contributions they had never considered, possessed a combat record that exceeded most of their own. The maintenance coveralls and cleaning equipment had been props in a performance that had required more skill and discipline than many of their most challenging operations. Commander Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and professional admiration. "Colonel," he said, his voice rough with emotion he was struggling to control. We had no idea." Storm turned her attention to Morrison, and he found himself looking into eyes that had seen combat from 30,000 feet and had made split-second decisions that determined whether warriors lived or died. The intelligence in those eyes was sharp enough to cut glass, and the experience behind them made his own considerable combat record seem modest by comparison. "That was the point, Commander," Storm replied, her tone neither harsh nor forgiving, simply factual. "An effective security assessment requires subjects to behave naturally. Your team's interactions with support personnel revealed valuable information about operational security, personnel awareness, and institutional blind spots that could be exploited by hostile intelligence services." The implications hit home with devastating clarity. Every casual conversation conducted in front of the maintenance worker, every document left unattended on a desk she was cleaning, every security protocol that had been relaxed because she was considered harmless, all of it had been observed, recorded, and analyzed by someone with the training and experience to understand its significance. Phoenix found her voice first, her intelligence background allowing her to process the situation more quickly than her colleagues. "Colonel, how long have you been planning this operation?" 2 years, Storm replied without hesitation. 18 months of preparation and infiltration, followed by 18 months of active intelligence gathering. The time frame was staggering, representing a level of patience and dedication that few could match. General Blackwood moved to stand beside Colonel Vasquez, the two women presenting a united front that radiated authority and competence. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the formation and highlighting the contrast between the assembled SEALs in their dress uniforms and the colonel still wearing her maintenance coveralls, though those coveralls no longer seemed to diminish her presence in any way. "Gentlemen," General Blackwood addressed the formation, her voice carrying the weight of command decisions that affected national security. "What you have witnessed this morning represents the conclusion of Operation Ghost Protocol, a comprehensive security assessment authorized at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Colonel Vasquez was selected for this mission not despite her previous challenges with military bureaucracy, but because of them." The reference to previous challenges hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Every member of the formation understood that there was more to Colonel Vasquez's story than had been revealed, darker chapters that had led to her temporary disappearance from active service and her assignment to this unprecedented mission. Colonel Vasquez stepped forward, her bearing now fully that of a senior officer addressing subordinates. "For 18 months, I observed your operations, your security protocols, and your personnel interactions. I listened to conversations that revealed classified information. I accessed areas that should have been restricted. I documented vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile forces." Each revelation hit the SEALs like incoming artillery. The security breaches she was describing weren't theoretical. They were actual failures that had occurred under their watch, observed by someone with the training to recognize their significance. "But," Colonel Vasquez continued, her voice softening slightly, "I also observed something else. I saw dedication that goes beyond duty. I witnessed professionalism that maintains standards even when no one of importance is watching. I documented a level of commitment to mission success that exceeds anything I encountered during my previous assignments." The subtle shift in tone was like a lifeline thrown to drowning men. After the devastating revelation of their security failures, the acknowledgement of their professional competence felt like redemption. Commander Morrison found his voice again, though it was rougher than usual. "Colonel, what happens now?" "Now," General Blackwood interrupted, "we implement the changes recommended by Colonel Vasquez's assessment. Some will be immediate. Others will require congressional approval and budget allocations that may take months to secure. But all of them will make this command more effective and more secure." Tank, still pale but recovering his composure, asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Ma'am, will the colonel be staying with the command?" Colonel Vasquez and General Blackwood exchanged a look that carried communication beyond words. Finally, the colonel spoke. "My next assignment is classified, but my time as your maintenance worker is officially concluded." The answer was both revealing and mysterious, suggesting that Storm's skills would continue to be utilized in ways that would never appear in official records. The general's aide approached with a sealed envelope, which General Blackwood accepted and immediately handed to Colonel Vasquez. The exchange was formal, ceremonial, and carried the weight of official orders that would shape the next phase of an extraordinary career. "Colonel Vasquez," General Blackwood said, her voice now carrying the formality of official pronouncement. "By order of the Secretary of Defense, and with the full authority of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you are hereby restored to full active duty status with all privileges, honors, and responsibilities attendant to your rank. Your previous administrative reassignment is officially concluded, and your service record is restored to its full and accurate state." The words struck the formation like thunder. The implications were staggering. Colonel Vasquez had not been assigned to janitorial duties as punishment or administrative convenience. She had been placed in deep cover as part of a mission that required the sacrifice of her public identity and reputation. For 18 months, she had endured the casual dismissal and invisible status that came with her cover identity, all while serving her country at the highest levels of classified operations. Storm accepted the envelope with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of what was occurring. The document inside represented more than just restored rank and privileges. It was vindication for sacrifices that few would ever understand and fewer still would be capable of making. "Thank you, General," Storm replied, her voice carrying emotions that had been carefully controlled for 18 months. "It has been an honor to serve." The exchange complete, both women turned to face the formation of SEALs who were struggling to process the morning's revelations. These men were accustomed to extraordinary situations, trained to adapt to changing circumstances, and experienced in operations that defied conventional understanding. But witnessing the transformation of their invisible maintenance worker into a decorated colonel had challenged every assumption they held about awareness, perception, and the nature of service itself. Phoenix stepped forward, her intelligence training allowing her to formulate the questions that others were still struggling to articulate. "Colonel, during your time here, were there specific security vulnerabilities that require immediate attention?" Storm's expression became more serious, the weight of professional responsibility replacing the emotional relief of restored identity. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, there were 14 major security violations and 37 minor infractions documented during my assignment. 3 of the major violations represent immediate threats to operational security that require correction within 72 hours. The specificity of her response drove home the reality that this had been a genuine intelligence operation, with serious implications for national security. The woman they had dismissed as invisible had been conducting a professional assessment that would influence policy and procedure at the highest levels of command. General Blackwood consulted her watch, the gesture carrying implications of schedules and appointments that extended far beyond this single compound. "Colonel, we have a briefing with Pacific Fleet Command at 1400 hours. Your assessment will be presented to Admiral Richardson and his senior staff this afternoon." The revelation that Colonel Vasquez's findings would be briefed to flag officers within hours underscored the importance of Operation Ghost Protocol. The morning sun had reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the compound and highlighting every detail of a scene that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their careers. The helicopter that had brought General Blackwood continued its slow rotation on the landing pad, rotors spinning lazily in preparation for departure. But the real transformation had already occurred in the minds and hearts of the men who had learned that their assumptions about invisibility, importance, and service had been fundamentally wrong. Colonel Vasquez began removing her maintenance coveralls with the same methodical precision she had displayed during 18 months of cleaning duties. Underneath, she wore a crisp set of Army combat uniforms bearing the insignia of her rank and branch. The transformation was both symbolic and practical. The invisible maintenance worker was disappearing forever, replaced by an officer whose presence commanded immediate respect and attention. As she folded the coveralls with military precision, Storm caught Commander Morrison's eye. "Commander, your team's operational security is generally excellent. The vulnerabilities I documented were systemic issues, not failures of individual performance. Your men have nothing to be ashamed of." The reassurance was professional and precise, but it also carried an undertone of understanding that went beyond military protocol. Storm had observed these men during their most unguarded moments, had seen them interact with each other, and with support personnel when they believed no one of importance was watching. Her assessment carried the weight of authentic observation rather than formal inspection. Tank found his voice, though it carried a rough edge of emotion that he was struggling to control. "Colonel, I want to apologize. We should have. I mean the way we—" "Petty Officer Rodriguez," Storm interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of her restored rank, but also a gentleness that spoke to her understanding of his struggle. "You and your teammates treated support personnel with courtesy and professionalism. That was also part of my assessment. The fact that you didn't recognize my true identity speaks to the quality of my cover, not to any failure on your part." The explanation was both factual and kind, acknowledging the emotional impact of the morning's revelations, while maintaining the perspective necessary for professional relationships. Storm had learned to navigate the complex dynamics of military hierarchy during years of service that had tested every aspect of her character and competence. General Blackwood stepped closer to the formation, her presence commanding attention that went beyond rank or position. "Gentlemen, what you have witnessed this morning represents the highest standards of military service. Colonel Vasquez accepted an assignment that required her to sacrifice her public identity, her professional recognition, and her personal comfort for 18 months. She did so without complaint, without recognition, and without the support systems that normally sustain officers in challenging assignments." The general's words carried the weight of someone who understood the true cost of classified service, the sacrifices that were made in shadows and never acknowledged in public ceremonies. Phoenix, her intelligence background allowing her to process complex information quickly, asked the question that was troubling several members of the formation. "General, will Colonel Vasquez's findings result in personnel changes within our command?" It was a careful way of asking whether heads would roll, careers would be damaged, or punitive actions would follow. The briefing room had been cleared of all personnel except for the senior staff and the two women who had just concluded 18 months of the most unusual intelligence operation in naval special warfare history. Maps covered the walls, showing global deployment patterns and operational zones that spanned 3 continents. The morning's revelations had transformed this space from a routine administrative area into the epicenter of discussions that would influence special operations policy for years to come. Colonel Vasquez stood at the head of the table, no longer wearing maintenance coveralls but dressed in the Army combat uniform that proclaimed her true rank and position. The transformation was complete, but the intelligence she had gathered, while invisible, remained the most valuable asset in the room. Her 18 months of observations had been distilled into a comprehensive report that would reshape how the military approached security, personnel awareness, and operational procedures. General Blackwood took her seat at the table, her expression serious as she prepared to facilitate discussions that would have implications far beyond this single command. "Colonel, begin your briefing. Captain Jackson and his senior staff need to understand the full scope of your findings." Storm activated the presentation system with movements that were crisp and professional, her bearing now fully that of a senior officer conducting a critical briefing. The first slide appeared on the wall-mounted screen: Operation Ghost Protocol, Security Assessment and Personnel Evaluation. "For 18 months, Storm began, her voice carrying the authority of someone presenting findings that had been gathered through extraordinary personal sacrifice. "I maintained deep cover as a maintenance worker within this compound. My mission was to assess security protocols, document vulnerabilities, and evaluate personnel performance under normal operational conditions." Captain Jackson leaned forward, his expression a mixture of professional interest and personal discomfort. The idea that his command had been under surveillance by someone with Storm's qualifications was both humbling and troubling. "Colonel, what was the scope of your access?" "Complete," Storm replied without hesitation. "I had unrestricted movement throughout the compound during normal maintenance operations. I accessed secure areas, observed classified briefings, and documented information that could compromise ongoing operations if it fell into hostile hands." The blunt assessment sent a chill through the room. These were men accustomed to operating in environments where security meant the difference between life and death, yet they had unknowingly allowed potential vulnerabilities to exist under their direct supervision. Storm advanced to the next slide, which displayed a schematic of the compound with areas color-coded according to security risk levels. Red zones indicated critical vulnerabilities, yellow areas showed moderate concerns, and green sections represented acceptable security standards. The amount of red on the diagram was sobering. 14 major security violations were documented, Storm continued, her tone clinical and precise. 3 require immediate correction to prevent potential compromise of ongoing operations. 11 can be addressed through policy changes and additional training. All represent systemic issues rather than individual failures. The distinction was important, and everyone in the room understood its significance. Storm was identifying problems with procedures and protocols, not attacking the competence or dedication of specific personnel. Commander Morrison, still struggling to reconcile the invisible maintenance worker with the decorated officer now briefing them, found his voice. "Colonel, what was your overall assessment of personnel performance?" Storm's expression softened slightly, though her professional demeanor remained intact. "Outstanding." The response was immediate, definitive, and carried the weight of authentic observation rather than diplomatic courtesy. The helicopter lifted off from the compound with the same precision it had demonstrated during landing, carrying General Blackwood and Colonel Vasquez toward their next appointment with Pacific Fleet Command. Through the aircraft's windows, they could see the Naval Special Warfare compound growing smaller beneath them, but the impact of Operation Ghost Protocol would continue to reverberate through military circles for months to come. Storm settled into her seat, feeling the familiar sensation of flight that had been absent from her life during 18 months of ground-based operations. The sky stretched endlessly around them, blue and infinite, a reminder of the environment where she had earned her reputation as one of the military's most skilled pilots. The return to flight status was more than just professional rehabilitation. It was a homecoming to the realm where she had always been most effective. General Blackwood reviewed a classified tablet, her expression focused on agenda items that would consume the rest of their day. "Colonel, Admiral Richardson has requested a complete briefing on your findings. He's particularly interested in the implications for other commands throughout Pacific Fleet." The request was both an honor and a responsibility that extended far beyond the single compound, where Storm had spent 18 months in disguise. Her observations and recommendations would influence security procedures at dozens of installations across the Pacific Theater, affecting thousands of military personnel and operations that spanned half the globe. "General," Storm replied, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had thoroughly prepared for this moment, "the vulnerabilities I documented at Naval Special Warfare Group 1 are likely present at other commands. The systemic nature of these issues suggests that comprehensive review and reform may be necessary throughout the special operations community." It was a diplomatic way of saying that the problems she had identified were probably widespread, requiring solutions that would challenge existing procedures and assumptions about security in military installations. The implications were staggering, suggesting that hostile intelligence services might have been exploiting similar vulnerabilities at other locations for unknown periods of time. The helicopter banked slightly, adjusting course for the flight to Pacific Fleet headquarters, and Storm felt the familiar pull of acceleration that reminded her of carrier launches and combat missions in distant skies. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who had survived challenges that would have broken lesser individuals: the loss of her flying career, the humiliation of administrative reassignment, and the psychological demands of maintaining deep cover for 18 months. But survival wasn't the same as victory, and Storm understood that her real vindication would come not from restored rank or official recognition, but from the implementation of changes that would protect future operations and the warriors who conducted them. The intelligence she had gathered, while invisible, would only have value if it resulted in concrete improvements to security and operational effectiveness. General Blackwood looked up from her tablet, her expression thoughtful. "Colonel, I need to ask you something that isn't covered in your official report. How did it feel to be invisible for 18 months, to have your expertise dismissed and your presence ignored?" The question was personal rather than professional, cutting to the emotional core of an experience that had tested every aspect of Storm's character and resilience. Storm considered her response carefully, understanding that honest reflection was as important as tactical analysis. "It was the most difficult assignment of my career, not because of physical hardship or operational danger, but because it required me to deny my identity and capabilities on a daily basis. Every instinct that had made me effective as a pilot, assertiveness, confidence, leadership, had to be suppressed in favor of invisibility." She paused, watching the landscape pass beneath them as she searched for words that could adequately express the psychological complexity of her experience. "But it also taught me something valuable about perception and assumption. The same men who dismissed me as a maintenance worker would have listened respectfully to every word I said if they had known my true rank and background. The knowledge I possessed didn't change, but their willingness to hear it was entirely dependent on their perception of my authority." The observation carried implications that extended far beyond military hierarchy, touching on fundamental questions about how society values expertise based on external appearances rather than demonstrated competence. General Blackwood nodded thoughtfully, understanding that Storm's insights went beyond traditional military analysis. "And how do you think this experience will influence your future assignments?" "It will make me a better officer," Storm replied without hesitation. "Understanding how invisibility feels, how dismissal affects performance, and how assumptions can blind even the most professional individuals to important information. All of that will inform how I interact with subordinates, how I evaluate intelligence, and how I approach leadership challenges." The helicopter began its descent toward Pacific Fleet headquarters, bringing an end to the flight, but marking the beginning of a new phase in Colonel Vasquez's career. The woman who had spent 18 months being invisible was about to brief admirals on findings that would reshape military security procedures across the Pacific Theater. As they approached the landing zone, Storm caught sight of her reflection in the helicopter's window one final time. The maintenance worker was gone forever, replaced by an officer whose understanding of service had been deepened by sacrifice and whose commitment to excellence had been strengthened by adversity. The sky stretched endlessly around them, blue and infinite, waiting for whatever missions lay ahead. The woman who had once been called Ghost was now ready to reclaim her storm clouds and return to the heights where she had always belonged. The Pacific Fleet headquarters conference room buzzed with the controlled energy of flag officers and senior staff preparing for a briefing that promised to challenge their understanding of operational security. Admiral Thomas Richardson, commander of Pacific Fleet, reviewed the preliminary report that had been forwarded ahead of Colonel Vasquez's arrival, his weathered face reflecting the concern of someone responsible for military operations across half the world's oceans. At 62, Admiral Richardson had commanded everything from destroyers to carrier strike groups, his career spanning conflicts and peacekeeping missions that had taken him to every corner of the Pacific theater. The preliminary findings from Operation Ghost Protocol suggested vulnerabilities that could compromise ongoing operations and endanger the lives of sailors and Marines under his command. This was not theoretical analysis. It was actionable intelligence that demanded immediate attention. Colonel Vasquez entered the briefing room with General Blackwood, her bearing now fully that of a senior officer whose expertise commanded respect at the highest levels of military leadership. The transformation from invisible maintenance worker to decorated colonel was complete, but the intelligence she carried remained the most valuable asset in the room. 18 months of observations had been distilled into recommendations that would influence military policy across multiple commands and time zones. Admiral General Blackwood announced as the room came to attention, "I present Colonel Esperanza Vasquez, the